see, what class of cheetahs were we up to today? Oh no, this is the Sutta class. Okay, so we've been looking at Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 119. This is the discourse on mindfulness of the body. And the last time we did very briefly mindfulness of breathing, then we did the four postures. Now there's competition for So we did the four postures, and the section on here is translated full awareness, but I prefer clear comprehension. Okay, now we come to the section on what is called the meditation on foulness, or on the parts of the body. In the commentarial tradition, this is actually what is called the mindfulness directed to the body, Kāyagatāsati. It's also sometimes called patikula sanya, that is the perception of the repulsiveness of the body. But often in the suttas it's referred to as the asubha sanya. That's the perception of the non-beautiful or unattractive nature of the body. Okay, so here the text explains that again a bhikkhu, a monk, or actually it's any practitioner, reviews the same body, that means one's own body, up from the soles of the feet and down from the top of the hair, bounded by skin, as full of many kinds of impurity thus. And by the word impurity here, asuci, it's not impurity in a moral sense, but things which are, maybe you could say, aesthetically unattractive. So in this body there are head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, and urine. So actually, if you count the parts here, there are 31 parts, but in the traditional way of practice, the brain, which is not included in the list here for some reason, is added. And so the usual way this is practiced is with 32 parts of the body. And the brain is added after after feces and before the bile. Okay, if you look at the work called the Visuddhimagga, that's the path of purification, the main treatise in the Theravada tradition on the different subjects of meditation. This subject is explained in a very complex way or complicated way. I think the way intended for those who wish to make this their full-time meditation subject. So first one has to learn all of the parts by rote, and then one has to review the parts by going through them in a particular sequence. And I have to say, a little disagreement with the Visuddhimagga method, because the method the Visuddhimagga recommends goes like this. One starts off with head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin. Then one goes backwards, skin, teeth, nails, body hairs, head hairs. Then one goes again in forward order from head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin. Then one brings in flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart. Then one goes from heart, flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys. Then one goes from kidneys back to head hairs, from head hairs back up to kidneys. Then one brings in heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs. Then from lungs back to head hairs. Then from head hairs up to lungs. Then one adds intestines, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, brain. Then from brain back to head hairs. Then from head hairs forward to brain. Then one brings in bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat. Then from sweat back to head hairs. From head hairs forward to sweat. Then one brings in fat, tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, and urine. Then from urine back to head hairs, and from head hairs forward to urine. But in this way, you keep on bringing in, it seems to give disproportionate emphasis to those items that occur earlier in the list, whereas those that come later in the list only get hit a few times. You know, if you were keeping like a counter like they do on the computer to see how many hits a website gets, the first 5 would get hit 8 times, something like that, 8 to 10 times, whereas the last ones would only get hit 3. So it seems to have, one should have a balanced attention to each of the parts. So I found a more reasonable way to do it was to go from head hairs, up to skin, from skin back to head hairs, then from head hairs, then you go to flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, then from kidneys back to flesh, then from flesh up to heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, then from lungs back to heart, then from heart up to lungs, then from intestine, then intestines, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, brain, then from brain back to intestines, from intestines up to brain, then feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, then from fat back to bile, from bile up to fat, then tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, and urine, then from urine back to tears, then from tears forward to urine. In this way, each part gets hit equally 3 times. And then according to the Visuddhimagga method, one is supposed to review each part as repulsive in terms, I think that there were 5 aspects. Let's see, in terms of the color, shape, odor, each part individually, location, and the environment, that is the surrounding parts. But this seems to make it so, as I said, so complex that it's rather difficult to practice. And how is a practitioner going to get the distinct smell of taking out the spleen, taking a sniff, pulling out the stomach, getting a clear sense of how that smells differently from the spleen, then opening up the skull and taking out the brain, getting a good sniff of that. So at least for sort of practical, everyday usage, I think it's sufficient to get just a general sense of the repulsiveness in the appearance of the part. Of course, if you have a chance to view an autopsy, then you get a chance. I think it's sufficient to get the odor or the fragrance of a body that has been cut open with, the different juice of fluids coming out. We used to we used to do this in Sri Lanka. Some of us monks, we would go to the autopsy room in the Colombo General Hospital, and since the doctor in charge of that room at the time, this was the early mid-1980s, was a Buddhist, and so when Buddhist monks come knocking at the autopsy room, he welcomes them in, and he's happy to help them to learn as many of the 32 parts as they can get. And so I remember a few times when they roll the body out, and it really looks like a person sound asleep. You don't get a sense that it's a dead body, but then the doctor takes the scalpel and cuts into the flesh, pulls it open, and I want to shout out, "Don't do it, it's alive." He or she, it's alive. But then he starts, after cutting it open, pulling out, this is the heart, these are the lungs, this is the stomach, and he'll reach deep inside and starts pulling something out, like it looks like he's taking out a fire hose. These are the intestines. And then the most dramatic moment is when they take this, it's a particular name for a kind of saw. It's not the saw like this. It's shaped like a rectangle, and the blade is, one face is the blade. Do you remember? Anybody know the name for that kind of saw? Band saw. Yeah. So he starts cutting open the skull, and then at a certain point he just, gives it a knock, and the top of the skull opens up. He reaches in and takes out the brains and says, "These are the brains." I remember one time I had gone for an autopsy together with this English monk who lived a very austere, ascetic type of life. Like, he didn't stay in a fixed residence, but he would go walking all around the country, just staying from time to time at one monastery, another for a few days, a few weeks, then continue on his walking tour, always going on pindapata, on alms round. So very tough, austere monk. And I'm sort of the little scholar monk. But when we were watching the autopsy together, I was watching with absorbed interest, but we were both standing up. But he said to the doctor, "Do you have a chair?" I'm feeling a little bit faint. And then when this autopsy was almost over, the doctor's wife came in, all dolled up with like lipstick and makeup. And she said, she sort of saw what we were doing, and I said, "Oh, when you first see it, it's somewhat troublesome, but after a while you get used to it, then it's nothing." Okay, so anyway, I would suggest it's very useful for doing this meditation. The main purpose the main reason why the Buddha taught this meditation is for the practice, or for the purpose of reducing and eventually overcoming sensual lust for, especially for sexual enjoyment, because the desire for sexual enjoyment thrives on the basis of what is called subhasanya, which means the perception of beauty, the perception of the body as being something beautiful and attractive. And so eventually, to overcome sensual lust, one has to overcome that perception of the body as being intrinsically attractive. And though this has to be overcome in relation to the bodies of others, but the Buddha doesn't suggest to the young monk, begin with the beautiful girl that you see on alms round, because if he begins with the beautiful girl that he sees on alms round, he'll be thinking hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth. Oh, what a charming smile she had. Skin. Oh, such nice, shiny skin. Okay, then going back to the hair of the head. Oh, those tresses that were blowing in the wind, just a little bit covering the eye. Oh, how beautiful, how wonderful. Let me drop her a message or give her a phone call. And so one begins with one's own body, because that's the safest place to begin. And so one has to get a sort of clear perception of the unattractive nature of one's own body. Then after one builds up sort of strength with one's own body, then one can begin to bring the body of somebody else in, but not the person who one feels a sexual attraction to, but could be just an ordinary person. And maybe at the very end, when one really has strong development, one could experiment a little, bringing in an attractive person. And if one is doing this just as a supplement to one's regular practice, I find it sufficient to go through the list, the way I said, in groups generally of 5 and 6 parts, to go through in forward order and in reverse order, doing it according to the method so that you touch each part 3 times. And it doesn't bring its results immediately. Like any meditation subject, it's something that one has to practice repeatedly over a long period. But when one does it repeatedly, then one gets a real sense of the intrinsically unattractive nature of the body. And it's not intended to generate a kind of emotional repugnance to the body or a kind of disgust, an emotional disgust with the body. But when it's practiced, and in fact, if a person starts to give rise to those kinds of thoughts of emotional disgust with the body, then this is not the appropriate meditation subject for them, or it's not the appropriate time for them to be practicing that meditation subject. Rather, a person who has the emotional disgust towards the body, I think that person by temperament should be developing something like loving kindness meditation. But it's the person who tends to have a strong, passionate interest in the body, strong sexual desire, for whom this is recommended as a full-time meditation subject. But generally it's useful for anybody who wants to live the celibate life of a monastic, or even in Sri Lanka on the Uposatha days, that is the days of the full moon, when many people go to the temples and monasteries to observe the 8 precepts. Many of them practice this meditation. Another benefit of this meditation subject, apart from reducing sexual desire, is that it reduces pride or conceit in one's own body. So this is why it's also useful for a person who has, maybe somebody who's beautiful, handsome, very shapely, a woman with a very shapely figure, a man with a very muscular body, very handsome. Because if one does this, then one sees, what is this body that I'm so proud of, that I am rating myself as being more beautiful, more handsome, more attractive than others? One sees this body, it's just a collection of these parts, and if you take these parts, lay them out individually, there's nothing attractive about them, nothing to be proud about them. Am I so proud about my lungs? About my heart? My stomach? Look, I have the most beautiful stomach in Putnam County. I have the most sweet and charming large intestines. Look at those curves in my intestines. Those really sexy curves. And my feces, man. Gold ribbon. Winner of the gold ribbon 3 years in a row. I have to blow my nose into the handkerchief. Wouldn't you like me to sign my name on the handkerchief and give it to you, and you could take it home and frame it? Okay, so then to illustrate the way one is to look at the body, the Buddha says, just as though there were a bag with an opening at both ends full of many sorts of grain, such as different kinds of rice, hill rice, red rice, beans, peas, millet, and white rice, and then a man with good eyesight were to open it and to look at it thus, and he were to distinguish the different types of grains and peas. And in the same way, the monk reviews the same body is full of many kinds of impurity thus. Okay, and then he continues with the refrain passage. As he abides thus diligent, ardent, and resolute, his memories and intentions based on the household life or the worldly life are abandoned, and with their abandoning, his mind becomes steadied, internally quieted, brought to singleness, and concentrated. This is how a bhikkhu develops mindfulness of the body. And I should add a short way to do this meditation. Well, what the Visuddhimagga recommends is that as one is going through the 32 parts, as one is doing it over and over, at a certain point, certain parts will stand out sort of more clearly, more distinctly to one's mental perception. Other parts will be more vaguer and more obscure. And so at that point, one drops the more obscure parts and just retains the more prominent parts. Say 5 or 6 prominent parts, and goes through those until out of those 5 or 6 parts, one part stands out as more prominent. Then one just chooses that one part and focuses exclusively on that. And so I know monks in Sri Lanka who've practiced this meditation, generally they wind up focusing on the one part that they retain is the skeleton. And in meditation monasteries in Sri Lanka, in one room or another, generally there'll be a real skeleton hanging. It would be the skeleton that they've obtained from the hospital. Or maybe you don't obtain the skeleton from the hospital. Someplace they obtain a skeleton, they have the skeleton hanging there. So somebody who wants to practice this meditation can go there and view the skeleton, get the impression of the skeleton, and then go back to their room to meditate on it. But to do this meditation in a more compressed way, what I found useful is just to take, I think, 4 or 5 parts. What I've done is to take the skin, the flesh, it's the muscles, then just take the internal organs comprehensively, bones and blood, and then go back from blood, bones, internal organs, flesh, and the skin. So if one wants to practice this, one could experiment with different ways. It's good at the beginning to go through all 32 parts, hitting each part 3 times by taking them in groups of 5 or 6. Okay, and so the purpose of the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body is to help to overcome sensual desire and also pride or conceit with regard to the body. Okay, now we have a meditation subject which is somewhat similar to the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body, except that there's a different perspective that is adopted. This is the meditation on the elements. And so here the text reads, "Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu reviews the same body, however it is placed, however disposed, as consisting of elements thus." And when the text says, however it is placed, however it is disposed, this means that one could do this meditation on the elements in any posture. So it's not confined to the sitting posture, though generally at the outset one could build up sort of more momentum with it by starting with the sitting posture. But eventually one could do it while engaged in walking back and forth, even in lying down. But one reviews this body as consisting of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. And then the Buddha gives a simile. Just as though a skilled butcher or his apprentice had killed a cow and was seated at the crossroads with it cut up into pieces, so too the monk reviews the same body, however it is placed, however disposed, as consisting of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, water element, fire element, and the air element. Okay, so in practical terms, how is this meditation subject to be practiced? There are actually 2 methods of practicing this subject. 2 general methods. One is the concise but somewhat more difficult method, and then there's the more detailed but somewhat easier method. The more detailed or easier method works with 42 aspects of the body rather than the 31 or 32. in the meditation on the foulness of the body. And we see this 32-fold method, the 42-fold method in the Buddha's instructions to his son Rahula in Sutta number 62. Okay, now, sort of philosophically, that is in the Abhidharmic sense, well actually this is in agreement with the suttas also, the four great elements are present in all material substances, but different material substances have a prominence of one element or another. And so when one takes the parts of the body, even though in all the parts of the body, all four elements are present, but certain parts of the body more distinctively will represent one element rather than another. So here, I'm on page 528 now. The Buddha is explaining to Rahula how to meditate on the elements in the detailed way, taking different parts of the body or different bodily processes to represent different elements. So first, in section 8, he takes the earth element. So he explains whatever internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. Then we just go to the end of that sentence. This is called the internal earth element. And then what is representing the earth element are the parts of the body starting from the head hairs and the body hairs down through nails, teeth, skin, and then continuing to the contents of the stomach, the feces, and then the tradition will add the brain. So here we have, I think, 20 parts representing the earth element. Okay, then to take the water element, one takes those parts of the body or components of the body that are fluid in nature. And so here the Buddha brings up the question, what is the water element? The water element may be either internal or external, but since this is mindfulness of the body, one is just focusing on the internal aspect. So what is the internal water element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is water, watery and clung to, or whatever is liquid, liquidish and clung to. This is called the internal water element. And these are the, I think that's 12 parts: bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, and urine, or anything else internally that is liquid. So all that is the water element. Then to take the fire element, the fire element again may be either internal or external, but here we're concerned, since it's a mindfulness of the body, we're concerned with the internal fire element. So what is it? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is fire, fiery, or we could say hot, and clung to. This is called the internal fire element, and this is explained under, I think it's 6 aspects. That by which one is warmed. So we all have a fixed body temperature. Generally it's in the neighborhood of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is considered a manifestation of the fire element. And it's that by which one ages, this is part of the Indian physiology, that it's maybe because they observe that when fruit gets warm, it starts to decay. And so the fire element is considered to be that which causes the body to age. It's the heating up of the body that causes the body to age. And that by which one is consumed, probably this is referring when one gets a fever, that occurs through a flaring up of the fire element in the body. And that by which one is eaten, drunk, consumed, and tasted gets completely digested. And so it's the fire element which is seen to have the role of digesting the food. So we have that which one is warmed, ages, and consumed. And that there's actually 4 processes mentioned here. I think I said 6, but these are 4. And so those are the 4 manifestations of the fire element. And then whatever else internally belonging to oneself is fire or fire-ish, hot, and clung to. So all that is called the internal fire element. And then we come to the air element or the wind element. And so what is the air element? The air element may be either internal or external. Then we're taking only the internal air element. So that is whatever internally belonging to oneself is air, airy, and clung to. This is the internal air element. And so these are said to be, the internal air element is said to consist of the upgoing winds, downgoing winds, winds or air in the belly, air in the bowels, the winds that course through the limbs. And according to the ancient Indian system of physiology, what we would now call nerve impulses, both sensory nerve impulses and motor impulses. The sensory nerve impulses are the nervous currents by which we are able to perceive things, and the motor nerve currents are the currents by which we move the body and activate the body. So now we speak in terms of nerve currents or neurotransmitters, but in ancient Indian physiology, those were held to be activities of the winds of the body. And those winds were considered aspects of the air element. Does anybody here know Ayurvedic medicine, the Indian system of medicine? You do? Is that held to be the case in? Okay. Okay, so these are the winds that course through the limbs, and then of course the most obvious manifestation of the air element or wind element is in-breathing and out-breathing. Okay, so one takes this as representing the air element, and then one goes through all of this whole process of reviewing the body again and again in terms of the parts that represent the earth element, the parts that represent the water element, parts or functions that represent the fire element, and the functions that represent the air element. So that is this sort of the detailed, more comprehensive way of doing the meditation on the elements. But at a certain point, then one could switch over to the more concise, sort of more concentrated, more powerful way of doing the meditation on the elements. And that is to go directly into or to pick up on the distinctive characteristic of each element. And so the way this would be done is to take, for the earth element, the distinctive characteristic is hardness or solidity. And there's actually a spectrum moving from hardness to softness along representing different degrees of intensity of the earth element. And so one would begin by taking something hard in the body, which one could feel to get a sense of the hardness. So one could take one's teeth and strike them together to see how the teeth are hard, or one could feel a particular bone, where the bone comes close to the skin, the elbow, for example, the fingernails, or the bones of the ankles. Okay, so one begins with this sense of hardness, which one picks up by actual touch, and then one starts moving through the body to feel hardness throughout the body. And generally, to be able to move into this method of practicing meditation on the elements, one needs either a pretty strongly focused mind, initially through something like mindfulness of breathing, or else one should have done the more extended, more complicated method of reflection on the elements first. Of course, if we just sit down and try to get that sense of hardness, it's very difficult. And even with a well-concentrated